A man saw a homeless girl on the street and decided to help her, to feed her and give her a chance to warm up. She seemed quiet and haggard, but when he noticed the tattoo on her arm, everything changed. His hand reached for the phone, and a few minutes later the police were already knocking on the door. Write in the comments what country you're from, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. The wind cut through the empty streets like a knife, carrying with it a chill that crept under the skin and settled in the bones. The city seemed to absorb the cold, its concrete and steel surfaces exhaling frost with every gust. Mark pulled his collar up, the coarse fabric of his worn jacket scratching against his neck. His footsteps echoed in the silence, a rhythmic tap that only emphasized the emptiness around him. He moved quickly, head down, his hands buried deep in his pockets. Mark was a creature of routine. Every day was a loop, the same route to work, the same sterile office with its rows of gray cubicles, the same vacant faces of his colleagues. His evenings were no different. He would return to his apartment, a spacious yet hollow place that offered only the comfort of solitude. He had made peace with the silence, convinced himself that the world beyond his four walls held nothing for him. He had been raised to see the world in black and white. His parents, strict and unyielding, had instilled in him a sense of caution, mistrust, really, toward those who were different. It wasn't hatred, not openly, but a cold, quiet segregation that dictated how he interacted with others. Mark had absorbed these lessons well, and they had shaped him into the isolated figure he was now, drifting through life like a ghost. As he approached the intersection near his building, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just another pile of trash left by the wind, a collection of discarded clothes and rags, but then it moved. He stopped, his breath visible in the air, and squinted through the dim light. It was a person, a girl, hunched over on the steps of an abandoned building. She was young, maybe in her early 20s. Her skin was dark, and her hair was tangled and matted, framing a face etched with exhaustion. Her clothes hung off her like shadows, torn and stained, offering little protection against the cold. She hugged her knees to her chest, her arms thin and marked with dirt. Her lips were a pale, unhealthy color, and she shivered with a violence that made her whole frame tremble. Mark's first instinct was to keep walking. People like her weren't his concern. He had spent his whole life building walls, keeping himself detached from anything that might disturb his carefully maintained order. His parents' voices echoed in his head, a chorus of warnings and judgments. She was a stranger, an unknown, and that made her a threat. But as he stood there, the wind biting at his skin, something shifted inside him. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they met his, he saw not danger, but a raw, unfiltered fear. There was no plea in her expression, no expectation, just a hollow acceptance, as if she had already resigned herself to the world's indifference. The world around him seemed to hold its breath. Mark could almost hear the gears in his head grinding against each other, old prejudices clashing with an unfamiliar sense of empathy. He imagined himself turning away, retreating to the safety of his apartment, but the image left a bitter taste in his mouth. Before he realized what he was doing, he took a step forward. His voice, when it came, was rough and unsteady, but it cut through the cold like a lifeline. She did not move at first, only blinked slowly, her expression unreadable. But then, inch by inch, she rose to her feet. Her movements were tentative, as if expecting the ground to crumble beneath her. When she approached, Mark could see just how fragile she was. Her skin was stretched tight over her cheekbones, her hands thin and trembling. The gap between them closed slowly, every step a test of trust. She followed him, maintaining a careful distance, her eyes dart into the shadows around them as if they might spring to life at any moment. The walk back to his apartment felt surreal. Mark's thoughts tangled into knots, a mess of doubt and unease. What was he doing? Why was he doing it? He had never been the type to reach out, to offer help to anyone, let alone someone like her. His mind offered him a dozen excuses to turn back, to send her away, but his legs kept moving forward, pulling him toward something he couldn't yet name. By the time they reached his building, his hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. He opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first. She hesitated, her body taut like a coiled spring, but eventually she crossed the threshold. As the door clicked shut behind them, the world outside seemed to disappear, swallowed by the silence of his apartment. Mark stood still, his back against the door, and for a moment, neither of them moved. He felt the air shift, the delicate balance of safety and suspicion settling over them. Mark had always thought of his apartment as a fortress, a place where nothing could reach him. Now, with a stranger standing in his living room, that illusion shattered. His space felt smaller, the walls pressing in, the air thick with uncertainty. But beneath the tension, there was a spark, faint but real, a sense that maybe, just maybe, this encounter was more than a mistake. And so, on a cold autumn night, two strangers stood on the edge of something new. Mark couldn't see the path ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. The apartment was quiet, the air inside noticeably warmer than the frigid night outside. The faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor were the only sounds filling the space. Mark stepped aside as the girl hesitantly entered, her eyes darting around the room with the wariness of someone unused to being indoors. The place was neat, almost sterile. Dark wooden floors stretched beneath bare white walls, devoid of any personal touches. No photos, no paintings, nothing to suggest that anyone truly lived here. A black leather couch sat stiffly in the living room, positioned in front of a television that Mark rarely turned on. The kitchen, visible from the entryway, was just as unremarkable. Clean surfaces, unused appliances, everything arranged with the precision of someone who didn't like disorder. She hesitated just inside the doorway, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, as if she expected to be asked to leave at any moment. Mark gestured vaguely toward the couch. "You can sit," he said, his voice flat, unfamiliar even to himself. She didn't move at first. Then, cautiously, she stepped forward, her thin frame barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. She perched on the edge of the couch, her posture stiff and alert, ready to spring up if necessary. Mark realized he had no idea what to do next. His decision to bring her here had been impulsive, driven by something he still didn't fully understand. Now, standing in the middle of his own living room with a complete stranger, he felt an unfamiliar sense of unease creeping up his spine. She was still shivering, though whether from cold or something else he couldn't tell. Her clothes were damp, the sleeves of her hoodie frayed at the ends. He cleared his throat and walked toward the hallway. "There's a bathroom down the hall," he said. "You can shower if you want. Clean towels are on the shelf." She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, as if trying to gauge whether there was a hidden condition attached to the offer. Then, without a word, she rose and moved toward the direction he had indicated. Mark watched her disappear behind the door, then exhaled, running a hand over his face. His apartment suddenly felt smaller, more claustrophobic. The presence of another person, especially someone like her, disturbed the careful balance he had spent years maintaining. To distract himself, he walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. It was sparsely stocked. He wasn't much of a cook, mostly surviving on takeout and whatever required minimal effort. He pulled out a carton of eggs, a loaf of bread, and some leftover soup from the night before. He wasn't sure if she would eat, but at least he could offer. As he set a pot on the stove, the sound of running water echoed through the apartment. It was a strange sensation, hearing something so human in his space. It had been a long time since he had shared his home with anyone, even temporarily. He glanced at the door to the bathroom, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't quite name. Who was she? She hadn't told him her name, hadn't said much of anything at all, and yet there was something about her, something that made him hesitate before drawing the invisible line that separated them. Steam drifted out from under the bathroom door, and a few minutes later, the water stopped. He turned his attention back to the stove, stirring the soup absently. When she emerged, she looked different. Her damp hair clung to her skin, curling slightly at the ends. Without the layer of grime that had coated her face, she looked younger than he had initially thought. But it was her eyes that held him in place. Deep, dark, cautious, scanning the room as if she were still waiting for the moment when everything would turn against her. She had changed into the clothes he had given her, a simple pair of sweatpants and a long-sleeved t-shirt, both slightly too big for her frame. She moved quietly, carefully, as if afraid to take up too much space. Mark gestured toward the small dining table. "Food's ready." She hesitated before stepping closer. She ate with deliberate movements as though expecting someone to snatch the plate away at any moment. He noticed how she held the spoon tightly, her fingers wrapped around it with quiet desperation. She didn't eat fast, but she didn't waste a single bite either. Mark watched her from across the table, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle he didn't yet understand. She barely looked at him, her attention fixed on the food in front of her. It struck him then how different their lives must have been to lead them here, to this moment. He had spent years avoiding people, shutting them out, keeping his world small and controlled. She, on the other hand, had been thrown into a world that had never given her the option to choose solitude. It had simply discarded her. For the first time that night, he felt something other than unease. He felt guilt. She finished her meal and carefully placed the spoon down, her hands folded into her lap. She looked up at him then, her expression unreadable but not ungrateful. A silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Mark knew better than to ask. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his own thoughts settle in. For the first time in a long time, his apartment didn't feel quite as empty. The apartment had settled into an eerie silence after dinner. The girl, still nameless to him, remained cautious, moving around as if afraid to disturb anything. She hadn't spoken much, only nodding when necessary, and Mark had stopped trying to fill the silence. The weight of what he had done, bringing a stranger into his home, was starting to press on him. She sat on the couch, her posture tense, her fingers gripping the sleeves of the oversized sweatshirt he had given her. He could tell she was exhausted, but she didn't allow herself to relax, as if still expecting something bad to happen. It was a familiar posture, one of survival. Mark stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, watching her with a detached curiosity. He still wasn't sure why he had done this. Pity? Guilt? A moment of weakness? None of it felt like him. His life was structured, predictable. Bringing a stranger into his space was neither of those things. Then his eyes fell on her wrist. A flicker of recognition jolted through him. She had shifted slightly, and in doing so, the sleeve of her sweatshirt had pulled back, revealing a tattoo on the inside of her wrist, a black rose entwined with a pair of initials. His stomach tightened. He had seen that tattoo before. A cold unease crawled up his spine as he turned towards the television, his mind piecing together fragments of memory. Earlier that evening, while she had been in the shower, the news had played in the background. He hadn't paid much attention at the time, but now it resurfaced with alarming clarity. Security footage from a jewelry store robbery, a young woman captured on camera, partially obscured by a hood. The only clear identifying mark had been a tattoo, a black rose, just like the one on her wrist. Mark forced himself to keep his expression neutral. His first instinct was denial. It couldn't be her, it was just a coincidence. But the more he looked, the more certain he became. His pulse picked up. He could hear the faint ringing of adrenaline in his ears. His apartment, which had moments ago felt unfamiliar because of her presence, now felt suffocating for an entirely different reason. Had he brought a criminal into his home? He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Panicking wouldn't help. He needed to think. She was still sitting there, unaware of his sudden realization. Her head was slightly lowered, her fingers tightening around the sleeves of the sweatshirt. If she noticed his gaze, she didn't react. Mark's mind raced. What was he supposed to do? Confront her? Call the police? Let her go? The last option felt the least logical. If she was dangerous, if she was running from something, letting her slip away could come back to bite him. But the alternative, handing her over to the authorities, wasn't as simple as it should have been. Because despite everything, she didn't seem dangerous. She seemed tired, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with life itself. Still, he couldn't ignore what he had seen. He turned back toward the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as he tried to ground himself. Think. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't acted aggressively. If anything, she had done the opposite. She had shrunk into herself, wary and defensive, like someone who expected hostility at any moment. Maybe she wasn't the real thief. Maybe she had been forced into it. Or maybe he was just making excuses. A flicker of movement caught his attention. She had shifted slightly, glancing toward the window. The motion was quick, subtle, but it sent another ripple of suspicion through him. She was checking for exits. His fingers curled into a fist against the countertop. She knew. She knew that he had seen. But she wasn't running. Not yet. The room felt charged with unspoken tension, an invisible wire strung tight between them. He needed more information. Mark turned back, forcing himself to look at her the way an outsider would. She was small, thin, starved even. Not the picture of a hardened criminal. If she had been involved in the robbery, had she been the mastermind? Or just another pawn? He needed to know, but he also needed to be careful. She was watching him now, her gaze cautious, guarded. Mark exhaled, loosening his grip on the counter. The situation had changed. Before, she'd been a stranger who needed help. Now, she was a question, a risk, a possible danger. And Mark wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next. Mark lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The darkness of the room pressed in around him, thick and heavy, but sleep refused to come. His mind was too restless, tangled with thoughts he couldn't push away. He had let a stranger into his home, a woman he now suspected of being a wanted criminal. That alone should have been enough to make him act, should have made him do something. But he hadn't. Instead, he had spent the evening observing her, questioning everything but taking no action. She was still here. He hadn't locked the door, hadn't threatened her, hadn't called the police. He had simply let her stay. Through the thin walls of the apartment, he could hear the occasional rustle of movement from the living room. She wasn't sleeping either. That was another thing. She hadn't even tried. She had curled up on the couch under the blanket he had given her body tense, her eyes staring into the dimness of the room long after the lights had been turned off. She knew. She knew that he had seen the tattoo. She knew that he knew who she was. And yet, she hadn't run. That was what unsettled him the most. Mark turned onto his side, exhaling sharply. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to pick up his phone and make the call. It would be easy. He had the number. A few words, and the police would be on their way. He wouldn't have to do anything after that. It wouldn't even be his problem anymore. But for some reason, he didn't move. Instead, he listened to the faint sounds of her shifting on the couch, restless, trapped in the same sleepless limbo he was. A part of him wondered if she was waiting for him to act. Maybe she was testing him. Or maybe she was just too tired to care anymore. His fingers twitched against the sheets. His entire life, he had prided himself on knowing the right thing to do. He followed the rules, kept his distance from trouble. And yet, here he was, hesitating when there was no real reason to. He knew what the right thing was, the responsible thing. Still, he waited. Minutes stretched into hours, and eventually, exhaustion took hold. His thoughts blurred together, and at some point, his body gave in, dragging him into an uneasy sleep. He woke to a noise. It was faint, just the sound of movement, barely more than a whisper against the silence. But it was enough to snap him fully awake. He stayed still, listening, his pulse hammering against his ribs. She was moving. Mark shifted quietly, easing himself up from the bed without making a sound. His senses sharpened, his body tense with anticipation. He stepped into the hallway, his bare feet making no noise against the floor. The dim light from the street lamps outside cast long shadows through the apartment, stretching across the walls in eerie shapes. She was near the door. His breath caught as he saw her silhouette, barely illuminated by the glow of the city outside. She was standing still, her head tilted slightly as if listening. Her posture was rigid, her hand hovering just above the doorknob. She wasn't running. She was deciding. Mark watched, frozen in place, caught between conflicting instincts. Then, slowly, she let her hand drop back to her side. She turned slightly, just enough that he could see the outline of her face, though her expression remained unreadable. She had known he was watching. A silent moment passed between them, heavy with something unspoken. Then she moved away from the door and returned to the couch. Mark exhaled, his lungs burning from holding his breath. She wasn't leaving, even when she had the chance, even when she could have disappeared into the night. He didn't know what to make of it. He turned back toward his room, his thoughts a chaotic mess. She was staying. And that meant something he still didn't understand. But he was beginning to realize that he needed to. Mark sat at the kitchen table, his fingers curled around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He hadn't slept. Not really. After his silent exchange with the girl last night, his mind had refused to settle. He had returned to his room, laid on his bed, and stared at the ceiling until the first traces of morning light bled through the window blinds. The weight of his decision pressed against his ribs like an iron bar. He had let her stay. Despite everything, despite what he knew, he had done nothing. He had told himself he was waiting, that he needed to be sure, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had hesitated. And now morning had arrived and she was still here. He could hear her shifting in the living room, the sound of the blanket rustling, the quiet exhale of breath as she woke. It was strange hearing another person move in his apartment. He had lived alone for years, grown used to silence, to the predictability of his own habits, but now there was something else, someone else, disrupting that balance. He glanced toward the phone on the counter. It would be so easy. A single call. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about himself. He had spent his entire life following rules, keeping himself detached from anything that might complicate things. This, bringing her here, letting her stay, this was a crack in his foundation, a crack he had no reason to allow. Before he could think too much, he stood, walked over to the phone, and picked it up. His fingers dialed the number almost automatically. The call connected. The voice on the other end was steady, professional, neutral. Mark gave them the address. Then he hung up. His stomach twisted as he set the phone down. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He didn't have time to dwell on it. A quiet, shuffling noise behind him made him turn. She was standing in the doorway of the living room watching him. Her eyes flicked toward the phone and then back to his face. She knew. Mark felt something cold settle in his chest. He had no idea what she was going to do. Run, fight, plead, but she did none of those things. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable, her posture strangely calm. A heavy silence stretched between them, and for a moment he almost spoke, almost said something he wasn't even sure how to put into words. But before he could, there was a knock at the door. Not a gentle one. A firm, authoritative knock. Her shoulders stiffened, but her expression remained composed. Mark moved toward the door, his pulse a steady thud in his ears. He didn't look at her as he reached for the handle, but he could feel her gaze on him. He opened the door. 2 officers stood outside, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. The taller one, a man in his late 40s with sharp eyes, gave Mark a quick nod before shifting his gaze past him, toward the girl. Ella Carter, he said, her name sharp in the cold air between them. She didn't flinch, didn't deny it, didn't try to run. Instead, she exhaled softly like someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time. She stepped forward. The other officer moved in, taking her wrists and pulling them behind her back. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs filled the space, and for some reason, it sent a sharp, unexpected pang through Mark's chest. She still didn't resist. She didn't even look at him. Mark stepped back as they led her toward the hallway. Then, just as she reached the doorway, she paused. She turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. And then, a smile, faint, almost imperceptible, but real. Mark felt something inside him tighten. She wasn't angry, she wasn't afraid, she was thanking him, and then she was gone. The door closed. The apartment was silent again. But for the first time in years, Mark felt like something inside of him had shifted, like a piece of himself had cracked open, letting in something he wasn't sure he could ever close off again. The apartment felt empty in a way it never had before. Mark had spent years cultivating solitude, making sure no one ever stayed long enough to disrupt the quiet order of his life. And yet, now that she was gone, now that the police had taken her away, the silence pressed against him like a suffocating weight. He found himself standing in the middle of his living room, staring at the couch where she had slept. The blanket was still there, slightly rumpled, as if she had only just risen. The mug she had used the night before still sat on the kitchen counter, a faint stain of tea at the bottom. For a moment, he considered clearing everything away, erasing any trace of her presence. But he didn't move. Instead, he turned toward the window and stared out at the street below. The morning had fully settled in now, the city waking up oblivious to the events that had just unfolded in his apartment. Somewhere out there, she was in the back of a police car, being processed, questioned. Her life had changed forever. And so had his. The thought made his stomach twist. He had made the right choice, hadn't he? He had done what any reasonable person would have done. She had been a fugitive. The police had been looking for her. He had simply followed the logical course of action. So why did he feel like he had lost something? The rest of the day passed in a haze. He didn't go to work. He barely ate. He moved through his apartment like a man who had been left behind by time, his thoughts circling back to the same moment over and over again. The look on her face before she left, the quiet acceptance in her eyes, the way she had smiled. That smile wouldn't leave him alone. He found himself turning on the television more than usual, flipping through the news channels with an impatience he didn't quite understand. He wasn't even sure what he was waiting for, but part of him felt like if he saw her name, if he heard an update, it would somehow make this real. 2 days passed before her face appeared on the screen. Mark had been half asleep on the couch, the remote still in his hand, when the familiar voice of a news anchor made him sit up. New developments in the jewelry store robbery case. His body tensed. The screen flickered, showing a grainy image of security footage, the same one they had aired before. A blurred figure moving through a jewelry store, quick and precise, grabbing valuables from a glass case. Then, a split screen. Her mugshot appeared on the right. Ella Carter. The news anchor continued speaking, her tone neutral, detached. They recounted the details of the case, the police report, the arrest, but then something changed. Mark's breath caught as the next words left the anchor's lips. New evidence suggests that Carter was not the mastermind behind the robbery, but rather a coerced participant. Investigators now believe she was acting under duress, forced to commit the crime by members of a larger criminal organization. He sat up straighter, his heart hammering. Forced, coerced. He leaned closer to the screen, as if doing so would make the words clearer. The segment continued, explaining that the true orchestrators of the crime had been arrested after Carter provided information that led to their capture. She had given a full confession, detailing how she had been threatened, how she had no choice but to comply. Mark's hands clenched into fists. She hadn't been lying low because she was guilty. She had been running because she had no one to turn to, and he had turned her in. His stomach twisted with something unfamiliar, something that settled deep in his chest like a dull ache. He had assumed he understood the situation. He had seen the tattoo, connected the dots, and made a judgment. He had thought he was doing the right thing, but he had never asked her, never given her a chance to explain. And yet, she had smiled at him. The news segment continued, stating that Carter's testimony had played a crucial role in bringing down the criminals behind the operation. The stolen goods had been recovered, and while Carter still faced charges, her cooperation meant a lighter sentence. Mark barely heard the rest. He shut off the television, his hand lingering on the remote. The apartment around him suddenly felt even emptier. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. She had been thanking him that night, not for turning her in, but for giving her a place to rest, for seeing her as something more than a fugitive, even if only for a night, for treating her like a person. Mark leaned back, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if following the rules had been the right thing to do. A week had passed since Mark saw the news report. Each day felt like a repetition of the last, a loop of quiet guilt and unanswered questions. He moved through his routines like a sleepwalker, his body on autopilot while his mind remained stuck in the past. Everything in his apartment remained untouched. The blanket on the couch, the mug on the counter, the faintest imprint of her presence still lingering in the air. He hadn't been able to bring himself to change anything, as if doing so would erase what little remained of her. He went to work, did his tasks, and returned home to the same echoing silence. His colleagues barely noticed his absence from real conversation, his muted responses blending into the white noise of office life. The world outside seemed to continue at its usual pace, oblivious to the internal storm he couldn't shake. One afternoon, as he was retrieving his mail from the box downstairs, Mark noticed a plain white envelope mixed in with the usual collection of bills and junk. It stood out for its simplicity. No return address, only his name written in a small, neat script. He hesitated, his thumb brushing over the raised edge of the seal. His mind raced through possibilities, each more improbable than the last. Back in his apartment, he sat at the kitchen table, the envelope resting on the worn wood in front of him. He stared at it for a long time before finally sliding his finger under the flap and tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with care. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope. Small, careful letters that seemed to carry the weight of every word. Mark's breath caught as he read the first line. "Dear Mark, I hope this letter finds you well." He read slowly, each sentence pulling him deeper into a reality he hadn't expected. It was from her, Ella. She had written to him. She explained that she had been released under a plea agreement. Her cooperation with the authorities had led to significant arrests, and as a result, her sentence had been reduced. She was now part of a rehabilitation program, staying in a halfway house while she rebuilt her life. It wasn't freedom, not completely, but it was a start. She wrote about how she had ended up involved with the criminals, how desperation and a lack of options had driven her to accept help from people who only saw her as a tool. She had a younger sister, sick and in need of medication they couldn't afford. When the job offer came, promising quick money, she had believed it was her only way out. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late. They had threatened her, made it clear that if she didn't comply, both she and her sister would suffer. Mark felt a tightness in his chest as he read her words. She described the robbery not as a choice but as a trap. How every moment in his apartment had been both a relief and a torment, knowing she was safe for a night but that it couldn't last. She had known he would turn her in. She had expected it. And still, she had thanked him, not for his decision, but for his kindness before it. That night, you made me feel human again. I thought it was something I'd lost forever. I don't blame you for what happened. If anything, you might have saved me. I don't know where I'd be if I hadn't been forced to confront everything. Sometimes the hardest truths lead to the most important changes. Her words were soft but unwavering. There was no bitterness, only acceptance and a hint of hope. She had started attending classes, learning skills that could help her find work. She had reconnected with her sister, who was being cared for by a support network in the city. They were not together yet, but they spoke often, building bridges that had long been burned by hardship. Mark read the letter twice, then a third time. Each pass through the words made his own guilt feel both sharper and softer. She had found a way forward, despite everything. She had found strength where he had seen only vulnerability. He set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. The room around him seemed to shift, the light from the window casting new patterns on the walls. His apartment, once a sanctuary of isolation, now felt like a relic of a life he no longer wanted, a life of detachment, of safe but empty choices. He reached for a pen. His fingers hovered over a blank piece of paper, the weight of his own hesitation pressing down on him. Then, slowly, he began to write. Dear Ella, I'm glad to hear you're doing well. I think about that night often, and I realize now that I was too afraid to ask the right questions. I hope you can forgive me for that. If you ever need a friend, I'm here. And if you ever want to meet up, I'd like to see how far you've come. You've already proven to be stronger than most. Take care, Mark. He folded the letter, slipping it into an envelope. As he sealed it, he felt a sense of closure, not an end, but a beginning. The choice to reach out, to open a door instead of closing it. He didn't know if she would respond. He didn't need to. It was enough to know that he had finally done something he wouldn't regret. Mark stood, the letter in his hand, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the silence around him not as a barrier, but as a space waiting to be filled. Mark slipped the letter into the mailbox with a sense of finality. The metal door clanged shut, and for a moment, he simply stood there, his fingers still resting on the cold surface. He knew that sending the letter did not guarantee anything. It might never reach her. She might choose not to respond. But for the first time, he had acted on something beyond fear and routine. He had chosen to bridge a gap he had spent most of his life maintaining. The walk back to his apartment felt different. The familiar streets, usually bathed in a dull monotony, seemed to hum with quiet potential. The gray concrete, the worn facades of the buildings, the faint rustle of trees lining the sidewalks, all of it seemed more alive, as if the world had taken a breath along with him. Days passed, each one blending into the next. Mark continued with his routines, but there was a subtle shift beneath the surface. He found himself lingering at the mailbox each evening, his fingers brushing over the envelopes, hoping to feel the distinct edge of a letter. His anticipation was cautious, a fragile hope he was careful not to let grow too wild. He went to work, but instead of letting the hours drag him down, he began to engage more. He noticed things he hadn't before, the quiet conversations between co-workers, the small gestures of kindness that passed unnoticed. He started joining in, offering to help, sharing a coffee break with someone he had never spoken to before. It was strange at first. His voice felt rough from disuse, his expressions awkward, but gradually it became easier. At home, he moved things around. The blanket she had used was folded neatly, but he didn't put it away. He started to bring color into his space, small things like a blue dish towel or a green houseplant. He let the light in, pulling back the heavy curtains that had kept the world out for so long. His apartment began to feel less like a shell and more like a home. One afternoon, nearly a month after he had sent his letter, he found a small envelope in his mailbox. His heart jumped in his chest, a quick, startling thud that echoed in his ears. He recognized the handwriting immediately, the same careful script, the same neat letters. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, his breath catching in his throat. Her letter was brief but warm. She wrote that she was doing well. Her rehabilitation program was almost complete, and she had started a part-time job at a small community center. She helped with youth programs, sharing her story with kids who were at risk of falling into the same traps she had. She had found a small apartment, nothing fancy, but hers. Her sister was coming to live with her soon, their separation finally coming to an end. She mentioned his letter, how it had surprised her. She hadn't expected to hear from him, but his words had meant more than he could know. It had taken courage to write back, but she wanted him to know that she held no anger, no blame. What he had done might have saved her, pushed her onto a path she might never have found otherwise. She said she would like to see him if he was ever in the area, to share a cup of coffee and talk not as strangers, but as two people who had survived something together. Mark read the letter 3 times, each pass softening the knot in his chest. She had given him something he hadn't realized he needed: forgiveness. It wasn't the kind of forgiveness that absolved him of guilt, but rather the kind that offered a chance to move forward without carrying the weight of the past. She had seen him not just as the man who had turned her in, but as someone who had also been lost and had found a way to reach out. The next weekend, Mark took a train to the neighboring city. The ride was quiet, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. He carried her letter in his jacket pocket, the edges worn from where his fingers had traced over it again and again. He didn't know what he would say when he saw her. He didn't even know if he would recognize her without the shadows of the past clinging to her frame. But he went anyway, the uncertainty a small price to pay for the possibility of connection. When he arrived, the community center was buzzing with life. Children played in the yard, their laughter spilling into the street. He stood at the entrance, his pulse quickening, his feet hesitating on the worn steps. He could leave now, turn back, slip into his old life and let this moment remain an unfinished chapter. But then he saw her. Ella stood near the doorway, speaking with a young boy whose face was a mixture of defiance and curiosity. She had a clipboard in her hand, her expression open and patient. She looked different, brighter. Her hair was pulled back, her clothes neat and purposeful. She moved with a confidence that hadn't been there before, a steadiness that spoke of hard-won peace. She looked up and saw him. For a second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then a smile broke across her face, warm and genuine, and the last of Mark's doubts fell away. They sat on a bench outside, a paper cup of coffee in each of their hands. The conversation flowed slowly at first, small talk mixed with careful pauses, but soon it opened up. She told him about her work, about her sister, about the small but significant victories of building a new life. He shared parts of himself, too. The loneliness, the need for change, the choice to reach out rather than close off. The afternoon stretched on, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows that felt more like whispers of the past than threats. When they finally said goodbye, it was with the promise of staying in touch. Mark left with more than he had arrived with. He had come seeking closure, but had found a beginning instead. On the train ride home, he looked out the window as the landscape blurred past. His reflection in the glass looked the same, but beneath the surface, he felt different. Lighter, more real. The city unfolded ahead of him, familiar yet new, as if the world had shifted just enough to reveal what had always been there, waiting. Mark knew the road ahead would not always be easy. The past had a way of lingering, its shadows long and persistent. But now he had something stronger, hope. And with that, he felt ready to face whatever came next, not as the man he had been, but as the man he was becoming. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos. Check out more on the channel. There's plenty waiting for you. And if you think someone else would like this, feel free to share it.